Jiho stepped down from the transport ship and felt the strange gravity of Vexthar pull at her boots. The moon's surface was unlike anything she had ever seen before. Tall crystal formations grew from the ground like frozen forests, catching the light from the distant star and throwing rainbow colors across everything. Some crystals were as tall as buildings, and others were small and delicate. The whole world seemed to shine from within. She adjusted her thermal jacket and checked her equipment. She was here for a simple mission: collect atmospheric samples, record data about the mineral composition, stay for 3 days, leave. That was all. Captain Minki had given her clear instructions, and Jiho always followed instructions. She was a good explorer, careful and professional. The human settlement was small, just a few buildings made of protective material that kept the harsh environment out. About 50 people lived and worked there. Scientists, engineers, and explorers like Jiho. Everyone had a job. Everyone stayed focused. There was no room for mistakes on a moon this dangerous. Jiho left the settlement after her first day. She wanted to collect samples from a wider area to give more accurate readings. The crystal formations in the distance looked interesting, and she believed they might contain useful information. She walked carefully across the rocky ground, her instruments beeping softly in her hands. The air was cold, but her jacket kept her warm. The silence was complete. No birds, no insects, no wind. Just the sound of her own breathing inside her helmet. As she moved between two large crystal formations, Jiho heard something. It was a small sound, almost impossible to notice, a sound like glass being touched very gently, repeated again and again. She stopped and listened. The sound came again, quieter this time. It sounded almost like crying, but not quite. It did not sound human. Jiho turned toward the sound and saw movement behind a crystal wall. Something small, something that was shaking. She moved closer slowly, carefully, the way you approach a scared animal. Every step was gentle. Every breath was quiet. Then she saw it. The creature was small, only about half her height, but shaped in a way that made her heart jump. It had a body like a statue made of glass, completely transparent except for colors that moved through it like water. The colors were deep blues and purples and greens, flowing and changing. It had many thin appendages that looked like arms but smooth and curved. And it was shaking. Its whole body was vibrating, and the colors inside it were flashing bright and dim, bright and dim. It was terrified. The creature saw Jiho and tried to move away. It made that sound again, that small glass-like chirping, but louder now, scared. The creature looked so fragile, like it might break into pieces at any moment. Without thinking much about it, Jiho began speaking in a soft voice. "It is okay. I will not hurt you. It is okay." She did not know if the creature could understand her words, but her voice was calm and kind. She kept talking as she moved slowly closer. "You are safe. Nothing will hurt you here. You are safe." The creature stopped moving away. It was still shaking, but now it watched Jiho with what looked like eyes. Though Jiho could not be completely sure. Everything about this being was so different from anything she had ever seen. Jiho understood something in that moment. She did not know how she understood it, but she did. This creature was young. This was a child, a baby, and it was alone. It was lost and afraid and alone, and no one was helping it. Without removing her helmet, Jiho began to unzip her thermal jacket. The cold would reach her in seconds through her suit, but she did not care. The young creature watched as she pulled the jacket from her shoulders. The jacket was blue and black, with a thick lining designed to keep humans warm in the freezing air of this moon. It was large and sturdy and warm. Jiho held it out slowly. "Here," she whispered. "This will keep you warm. You do not need to be afraid anymore." The creature moved forward, slowly, so slowly. Each step was careful and uncertain. The colors inside its body were still flashing, still showing fear, but it was moving toward Jiho anyway. It was being brave. When the creature was close enough, Jiho gently wrapped the jacket around it. The thermal material was much bigger than the creature, and it covered most of its small body. The young being made a different sound now, not a scared sound. It sounded like relief. It sounded like comfort. The colors inside the creature began to slow down. The flashing stopped. The blues and purples and greens became steady and calm. The shaking became less strong. The creature pulled the jacket closer around itself, holding the edges with its appendages like hands. Jiho sat down on the cold ground. Not caring that the cold was already starting to hurt, she just watched the young creature discover what warmth and safety felt like. She watched as it began to breathe slower. She watched as fear left its body. "What is your name?" Jiho asked softly, even though she knew the creature probably did not speak her language. But she wanted to name it something. She wanted to remember this moment. The word that came to her was simple. "Taemin," she said. "Your name is Taemin." The creature looked up at her, and in that moment, something changed between them. Something that had nothing to do with words or language or species. Something that had to do with kindness. Something that had to do with one living being, helping another living being who was suffering. Taemin made that soft chirping sound again, but this time it was different. It was quieter. It was warm. It was the sound of a child who had found safety in a stranger's generosity. Jiho did not know that this simple act, this gift of a jacket to a frightened young creature on a distant moon, would change everything. She did not know that one moment of compassion would be remembered for generations. She only knew that she could not leave Taemin alone in the cold. So she stayed, and as the strange stars came out in the sky above them, human and alien child sat together in the silence, wrapped in a single thermal jacket, beginning something that neither of them could have predicted. 3 days had passed since Jiho found Taemin behind the crystal formations. She had broken many rules. She had missed work assignments. She had given false reports about her activities. She had spent every free moment with the young creature, and with every passing hour, the bond between them grew stronger. Taemin refused to leave her side. When Jiho tried to return to the settlement, the creature followed her, moving between the crystals and rocks in a clumsy way that showed it had never been outside its own group before. When Jiho sat in her living quarters in the colony, Taemin waited outside, pressing its transparent form against the window. When Jiho slept, she could see Taemin's shape in the darkness, keeping watch. The jacket, Jiho's thermal jacket, never left Taemin's body. The creature had grown attached to it in a way that seemed impossible for something made of crystal and light. The jacket had started to stretch around Taemin's body as the young alien grew, but it held together perfectly. It was as if the fabric recognized it had found its rightful owner. The other Vorthai, Jiho had learned that was the name of Taemin's species, kept their distance. They were strange beings. They communicated with sounds like glass chiming, and their bodies seemed to change colors depending on their emotions. They were logical and organized and cold in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. When Jiho saw other adult Vorthai in the distance, they would turn away and ignore her completely. When they saw Taemin in the jacket, they would make sharp, cutting sounds and move away even faster. On the 4th day, Captain Minki came to Jiho's quarters and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. His face was serious and disappointed. Minki was a good captain, fair and intelligent, but he was also strict about rules. "You have broken protocol 17 times, Minki said, reading from his computer pad. "You have filed false reports. You have missed required meetings. You have been seen with the alien creature. This is unacceptable." Jiho stood up, and outside the window, Tai Min made an anxious sound, the colors in its body flashing with worry. "Captain, I can explain," Jiho began, but Min-Ki raised his hand. "The Vorthai Council has sent a message," he continued. "They do not want you interacting with the young creature. They say it is counterproductive to the youth's development. They say the creature needs to learn to integrate with its own society, not form bonds with humans. The Council's words were very clear. This interaction is emotionally compromising. It must stop immediately." "That is not true," Jiho said firmly. "Taemin was alone and terrified. I gave him—" "You gave him dependency," Min-Ki said. "You have taught an alien child to rely on human comfort instead of developing its own strength. This is not kindness, Jiho. This is creating a problem." But Jiho looked out the window at Taemin, and she saw something the captain could not see. She saw that Taemin was no longer shaking all the time. She saw that the young creature's colors no longer flashed constantly with fear. She saw that Taemin had started to explore and move with curiosity instead of terror. She saw that the jacket had become like a symbol, a way for Taemin to remember that it was safe, that it was cared for, that it was not alone. "No," Jiho said. "I am not stopping." Min-Ki's face became hard and cold. "That is insubordination. I am ordering you to cease this interaction. If you do not follow this order, I will have you removed from this colony and sent back to the home world." Jiho looked at the captain and felt something she had never felt before in her professional life. She felt more loyalty to a young creature she had known for 4 days than to her entire mission, and she did not understand how that could be true, but it was. "Then I guess I am going home," she said quietly. Min-Ki left without another word, but before he reached the door, Taemin came inside. The creature moved quickly, with more grace than Jiho had ever seen it move, and wrapped itself around her legs. The jacket moved with Taemin's body, and Jiho realized the fabric had become so familiar to the creature that they moved almost as one being now. That night, Jiho received an emergency message from the settlement. She was being reassigned. She had 2 days to prepare for transfer. She sat on her bed and looked at Taemin, who would not stop making soft, chirping sounds of distress. But something unexpected happened the next morning. Other young Vorthai began to appear near the human settlement. They stayed at a distance, but they were visible. They were watching. They were curious about the young creature in the human's jacket, and as days passed, some of them moved closer. Some of them made the soft chirping sounds instead of the sharp, cutting ones the adults made. The older Vorthai did not seem to know how to control them. On the morning of her last day, as Jiho packed her belongings, a group of young creatures gathered outside the settlement. At least 20 of them, all watching Taemin. And Taemin, still wearing the now familiar thermal jacket, stood proud and calm among them, showing them that it was possible to be both Vorthai and connected to something new and strange and wonderful. Jiho realized something in that moment. She was not destroying Taemin's culture. She was changing it. And perhaps, she thought as she watched the young creature's colors shift from fearful to curious, that was exactly what needed to happen. The message came through Taemin. The young creature appeared at Jiho's door in the early morning, its colors flashing in a pattern that meant something urgent. The Vorthai elders wanted to see her. They wanted to see her now. Jiho had only a few hours left before her transport would arrive. She considered ignoring the message. She could leave Vexithar in a few hours and never return. She could go home to the human worlds and try to forget this strange, beautiful moon and the creature that had changed her life so completely. But she could not abandon Taemin without at least understanding what the elders wanted. The central chamber of the Vorthai was like nothing Jiho had ever seen. It was a massive dome made entirely of crystal that had grown from the ground itself. The inside walls were smooth and perfect, and they reflected light in ways that created constantly changing patterns. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. In the center of the chamber stood the elders. There were 5 of them, and they were enormous. Each one was at least twice the height of an adult human, and their bodies were covered in layers of crystal that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge. When they moved slowly, with absolute purpose. Every motion meant something. Every sound was important. The largest elder stepped forward. This was Kira, Tai Min's mother. Jiho felt very small standing before her. "Human," Kira said, her voice creating sounds like wind chimes mixed with thunder. "You have interfered with our young. You have contaminated the mind of my offspring with your ways. You have created weakness where there should be strength. We do not understand your actions, but we understand your result. You have broken fundamental rules of Vorthai development." Jiho wanted to argue, but she stayed quiet and listened. The elders had wisdom earned through countless years on this harsh moon. She could at least hear their concerns. Kira continued. "Our species survives through discipline, through control, through the rejection of emotional weakness. We do not comfort our young because comfort makes them soft. We do not show affection because affection clouds judgment. We teach them from birth that survival requires absolute control over all inner feeling. This is how we have endured on this world." "But your offspring has changed," another elder added, his colors flickering with something that might have been anger. "It shows curiosity. It displays what we would call contentment. It refuses to separate itself from your clothing. This is not growth. This is corruption." Jiho found her voice then. "With respect, Elder Kira, did you never feel fear? Did you never feel alone?" The chamber became completely silent. The other elders' colors flashed sharply, showing alarm. One even made a sound like breaking glass. But Kira did not respond immediately. The great elder's form became still, and her colors seemed to dim, growing less bright. It took a long time before she spoke again. "That is a question," Kira said slowly, "that I have not allowed myself to answer in 300 rotations of this moon." The other elders tried to interrupt, but Kira raised an appendage and stopped them. "I will tell you a thing," she said to Jiho. "I will tell you a memory that I have kept locked away because I believed it was a weakness to remember it." Kira moved to the edge of the crystal dome, and her massive form seemed to shrink somehow, not in size but in spirit. "When I was young, I was isolated. I was separated from my group for a full cycle of seasons because I was different. I was smaller than the other young ones. I grew at a different rate. The others rejected me because I did not fit into the pattern. I felt fear. I felt loneliness. I felt a need for connection that my entire society taught me was disgraceful." She turned back to Jiho. "I survived that isolation by learning to reject those feelings. I taught myself to feel nothing. I became the strongest because I felt the least. I became an elder because I showed the world that I was capable of absolute control, and I have spent 300 rotations believing this was the only way to be strong." Kira looked toward the window, where Taemin waited outside, still wearing the thermal jacket. "But my offspring," Kira said, her voice becoming something almost like wonder. "My offspring has experienced what I rejected, and my offspring is not weak. My offspring is more curious, more engaged, more alive than any young Vorthai I have ever witnessed. My offspring wears your jacket like a badge of honor. My offspring refuses to be ashamed of the comfort it received." The other elders were making nervous sounds, but Kira was not finished. "I will not order you to leave, human," she said. "I will not demand that my offspring reject you. I have spent my entire existence as leader of my people teaching them that survival means feeling nothing. But I see now that perhaps I have taught them to survive a different world than the one they actually live in. Jiho felt tears forming in her eyes, something she would not have expected to happen during such a meeting. Your people will evolve, Jiho said softly, if you let them. Not all change is destruction, Elder Kira. Sometimes change is just growth. Kira was quiet for a long moment. Then she made a sound, not like wind chimes or breaking glass, but like something new, something that sounded almost like an agreement. Perhaps, Kira said, it is time for our species to learn that strength and emotion are not opposites. Perhaps it is time we learned what this human has taught my child. As Jiho left the crystal chamber, she saw the other young Vorthai gathering in even larger numbers outside. Taimin moved among them, the thermal jacket still wrapped around its growing form, showing them all that it was possible to be strong and connected, to be Vorthai and loved, to be both the creature they were and something more. And in that moment, Jiho understood. She would not be leaving Vexathar. She would not be going home. She had already found her home here in a place she never expected, with a creature she had given her jacket to only a few days before. Sometimes, she thought, the most important discoveries happen not in laboratories or research facilities, but in the quiet moments when one being reaches out to help another, with nothing but kindness and an old thermal jacket. Weeks turned into months, and the changes on Vexthar became impossible to ignore. The young Vorthai had begun to transform in ways that no one had predicted. They gathered together regularly now, not to complete assigned tasks, but simply to exist in each other's presence. Some of them had started making sounds that were not the usual efficient communications. Some of them were making what could only be described as music. The adult Vorthai did not know what to do about this. The old rules did not cover situations like this. The old systems did not have protocols for young creatures who chose to gather for reasons other than survival or reproduction. The old ways of thinking could not explain why their offspring were showing behaviors that had been considered unproductive for centuries. But Elder Kira had made a decision. She would allow this change to continue, at least for now, at least to see where it led. Taimin had become something unexpected, something that surprised even Jiho. The creature was still wearing her jacket, but Taimin had grown significantly. The thermal fabric had stretched and adapted, becoming almost part of the creature's body. It no longer looked like a human was wearing an alien's clothes. It looked like something new, something that belonged to both species, something that represented the connection between them. When a new human ship arrived on Vexthar, it brought Dr. Haywan, a scientist who specialized in studying alien life forms and consciousness. She was brilliant and curious, and when she saw Taimin and the other young Vorthai, she became fascinated. She spent her first week simply observing, taking notes, recording everything she saw. On the 8th day, Haywan asked permission to study Taimin more closely. She had special equipment that could measure neural patterns and consciousness structures. Jiho was nervous about this, but Taimin was willing. The young creature understood that knowledge was important, and Haywan's curiosity seemed kind rather than invasive. When the measurements were complete, Haywan's eyes grew wide. She looked at the numbers on her screen again and again, as if she could not believe what she was seeing. "This is incredible," Haywan said, her voice shaking slightly. "This is actually incredible." "What is it?" Jiho asked, moving to look at the screen. "The neural pathways," Haywan explained, pointing at complex diagrams that showed Taimin's brain structures. "In typical Vorthai, certain areas of consciousness are dormant, completely inactive. Researchers have always assumed these were vestigial structures, left over from an earlier stage of their evolution. But look at this." She pulled up a comparison of different Vorthai neural patterns. The young ones who had spent time with Jiho and the human settlement showed dramatic differences. "The dormant areas are waking up," HFY said, her excitement building. "These young creatures, they are developing neural pathways that the adult Vorthai have shut down. They are accessing regions of consciousness that were supposed to be forever closed. They are not just learning emotions or behaviors. They are becoming capable of experiencing entire categories of consciousness that their species had abandoned." Jiho looked at Tai Min, and the creature made a soft, peaceful sound. "They are becoming more," HFY continued. "Not less, not corrupted, more complex, more whole. Your jacket, Jiho, it did not damage this creature. It activated something. It awakened something that was always there. Just waiting for someone to show it that feeling did not equal weakness." Word of HFY's discoveries spread through the human settlement and eventually reached the ears of the Vorthai Council. Some of the elders were pleased, some were alarmed, but the evidence was clear. The young Vorthai were not becoming weaker. In many ways, they were becoming stronger, more adaptive, more capable of understanding complex situations, more able to work with humans as true partners rather than as logical entities following protocols. By the end of 3 months, the council made an official decision. Cultural exchange with the humans would be permitted and encouraged. Young Vorthai would be allowed to spend time with the human settlement. Humans would be allowed to study Vorthai culture more deeply. And most importantly, the old, strict rules about emotional suppression would be gradually relaxed. It was a revolution without violence, a transformation through understanding. Meanwhile, Tai Min had become a symbol among the young Vorthai. The creature was now almost as tall as an adult, but it still refused to remove or replace the thermal jacket. The fabric was weathered now, with small tears that had been carefully patched. The color had faded from the constant exposure to Vexithar's intense radiation, but to Tai Min, it was perfect. "Why will you not let me repair it?" HFY asked one day, examining the jacket. "I can restore it to perfect condition. I can make it look new again." Tai Min made a sound, not the old afraid chirping or the efficient communication sounds, but something in between. Something that expressed an idea that Vorthai had not been able to express before. "Because it tells the story," Jiho translated, understanding what Tai Min meant even though the creature had not used words. "It shows what happened. It shows the journey. Making it new again would mean forgetting. And Tai Min does not want to forget." Other young Vorthai began to wear items from the human settlement. Scarves, belts, pieces of cloth and fabric that meant nothing to the humans, but meant everything to the Vorthai who wore them. Each piece told a story. Each piece represented a moment when another species had reached out and offered something. Not a command, not a duty, just a gift. By the end of the 4th month, Vexthar had become something different from what it had been before. It was no longer just a human outpost on an alien moon. It was no longer just a place where a crystalline species survived through pure logic and control. It was becoming something new, a place where 2 kinds of consciousness were learning from each other, a place where weakness was being discovered to be a kind of strength, a place where a simple thermal jacket, given freely to a frightened child, had changed everything. The warning systems started screaming at the same time as the ground shook. Jiho was in the research center with HFY and several young Vorthai when the first alert came through. The massive automated voice announced that a meteor storm had been detected on approach to Vexthar. Impact was estimated within 40 minutes. Everyone moved quickly into emergency mode. The human settlement had procedures for this. They had drills. They had bunkers. But a meteor storm this close, this fast, was different from the simulations. This was real danger. Jiho ran through the colony, helping people move toward the protective shelters. She saw fear on human faces. She saw panic. She saw people who suddenly realized that all their careful planning might not be enough. When she made it back outside to help with the final evacuations, she saw the meteors beginning to fall. They looked like stars coming down from the sky, burning bright orange and red as they fell through the atmosphere. The first one hit about 2 kilometers from the settlement, and the impact sent a shock wave that knocked Jiho to the ground. She was struggling to get back up when the second impact hit. This one was closer, much closer. The settlement's outer structure was damaged. One of the buildings collapsed, and then a third meteor struck and everything went dark. Jiho felt pain, sharp and burning. Something had hit her on the side of her body. She knew she was injured, but in the chaos and noise and fear, she could not do anything about it. She saw lights, and then she saw nothing. When she woke up, she was in the medical bay. The walls were still shaking slightly, but the worst of the meteor storm had passed. A human doctor was checking her vitals, and Jiho could see from the monitor that she had suffered significant injuries: broken ribs, internal bleeding, serious damage to her left side. The doctor had put her in a medical suspension field that kept her still while her body healed. "You are very lucky," the doctor told her. "Another meter to the right, and the meteor fragment would have killed you instantly." Jiho tried to speak, but the suspension field prevented movement. She could only lie there and wait for her body to heal. Time passed strangely while she was in the suspension field. She could see through the transparent walls of her medical chamber. She could see other people being treated for injuries. She could see the settlement beginning the difficult work of repair and recovery. But she could not move. She could not help. She could only watch. And then something happened that the medical staff did not expect. Tae-min came to the medical bay. The creature moved past all the human medical personnel, ignoring their confused attempts to stop it. Tae-min walked directly to Jiho's medical chamber, and the young Vorthai placed one of its crystalline appendages against the transparent wall. "You need to move the alien creature away from the critical equipment," one of the nurses said to the doctor. But before anyone could do anything, more young Vorthai arrived, and then more, and then even more. Within an hour, there were at least 50 young creatures gathered around the medical facility, pressed up against the windows and walls. They were making sounds together, not the efficient communications of adult Vorthai, but something else. Something that sounded almost like singing. The adult Vorthai came too. They arrived slowly and carefully, moving with their usual calculated precision. But instead of ordering the young creatures away, they stopped and observed. They watched as their young gathered to support one of their human friends. They watched as Tae-min kept one crystalline appendage touching the wall where Jiho lay, keeping vigil like a guard who would never leave his post. Something shifted in the hearts of the older Vorthai in that moment. They saw what they had tried to prevent for so long. They saw their young making a choice that had nothing to do with survival or logic or efficiency. They saw their young doing something for another being simply because they cared. For the first time in Vorthai history, the older generation understood what their young had discovered. They understood that loyalty could exist without command, that sacrifice could happen without profit, that caring for another being was not weakness. It was strength expressed in a way they had never been taught to recognize. Jiho spent 3 days in the medical suspension field. For all 3 days, Tae-min remained nearby. The creature did not eat, did not rest significantly, did not move from the position where it could be close to the human it had come to love. And around Tae-min, the other young Vorthai stayed as well, keeping a vigil that would have seemed impossible weeks before. When the medical field finally released Jiho and she was able to move again, she looked out through the observation window and saw Tae-min. The creature's colors were dim from exhaustion, but when Tae-min saw Jiho, the colors brightened immediately. Jiho stood up slowly, careful of her healing ribs. She walked to the doorway of the medical chamber, and there was Tae-min. The young creature was wrapped in the thermal jacket, the same jacket that had started this entire story. The fabric was worn and faded and patched many times over, but it was still there. It was still protecting the one who had been given safety and warmth when safety and warmth were all that mattered. Taimin made a sound that was not a chirp or an efficient communication. It was a sound of joy, a sound of relief, a sound that expressed emotions that the Vorthai species had tried for centuries to reject, and that they had finally, through the example of one small human and one confused young creature, learned to embrace. Jiho reached out her hand, and Taimin touched it with the end of one crystalline appendage. Two beings from different worlds, different bodies, different consciousnesses. Connected by nothing more than kindness and care, and the understanding that no one should ever have to be alone when facing something frightening. Looking around the medical bay, Jiho could see that everything had changed. The crisis had proven something important. The young Vorthai had shown that they were capable of something their entire civilization had said was impossible. They had shown that emotion could be a source of strength. They had shown that the future of their species did not have to be the same as the past. As Heiwan helped Jiho walk slowly back to her quarters, the scientist was already making plans for new research, new studies, new ways to understand how two species could merge their consciousnesses and create something entirely new. But for now, Jiho just wanted to rest, and she wanted Taimin to rest as well. The young creature followed her every step, still refusing to leave her side, still wearing that thermal jacket like a crown, like a badge of honor, like the physical representation of everything it had learned about what it meant to be alive and cared for and never, ever alone again.